When you become a parent, you take on a bunch of daunting jobs that are really important that you may not know anything about. They're usually really hard. They're not usually compensated in anything financially. One of the ones that you may not have thought about is that by becoming a parent, you're now in charge of all of the choices about the technology that your kids are exposed to. And this may or may not be something that you know about, but you're going to have to dive in since technology is increasingly a part of the world and really influences the world that our kids grow up in. So I'm going to do a little bit of a dive into it today, share some of the things that I've done, some of the wins and losses, and things that I've found helpful in my life, and hopefully that'll be helpful for you. So welcome. This is the Talk to Me PDD podcast. Talk about all things technology and society, people management, leadership, knowledge work. Today, episode 46. Parent as CTO or Chief Technology Officer. If you like the content, please like and subscribe. Follow me on the YouTube channel, all the different platforms. So let's dive into it. This is an area that I'm incredibly passionate about. There's something working in the technology industry that I've thought about for a long time, ever since I've had kids. But even over the course of their lifetime, just seeing how much more technology gets integrated into our lives and into their lives, and where if we're not actively making decisions, sometimes it can get integrated in ways that aren't the best for our kids or aren't what we particularly want with our life and our culture. So before I get into kind of specific details of what I've done and what I've found helpful or harmful, I'll start with just some principles that I think are useful in this area and probably in every area of parenting. But especially with tech, think about modeling as really important. So the behavior and the way that you use technology as a parent and how your kids observe that is going to have an influence over what they do with technology, what they see as an appropriate way to use it, and a way that's maybe not appropriate to use it. And if there are things that you'd like your kids to do with technology or not, if you're consistent with those behaviors and they see you abiding by the same rules that you're asking them to follow, I think that helps a lot, and it just allows things to be more consistent and less of a fight because they're not saying that, hey, you're doing something and you're asking me to do something otherwise. A lot of parenting is all about setting and enforcing limits. The same is true with technology. Kids' role is often to test those limits and see if you're going to back them up and enforce the rules or if you're going to be lenient and let things slip. Again, this comes up with managing technology use and what they have access to. One of the tools that I think can be really useful is this idea of friction, and you can enable this at a technology level with a lot of different things. You can make it not necessarily impossible, but harder for kids to do things that you may not want them to do, or not make it so easy to download, particular applications or things like that. So thinking about friction as a tool, intentionally making things harder for your kids to access or for you to set up for them. I think it's a great tool in a lot of things, but it applies in this domain as well. When you do allow things or enforce or not enforce limits, you're often setting a precedent where it'll be an assumption that if you've done something one way or given one kid access to something at a certain age, that will be true for another kid at another age. It doesn't have to be this way, but if you're going to change what you set as a precedent before, it's often going to take a lot more effort than if you were just to keep things the way they were. So not that you can't make mistakes or do things differently based on the outcomes, but if you can kind of keep to the same rules that you set initially, I found that to be helpful and less of an argument for your kids to bring to the table. When it comes to technology, especially at younger ages, think about single-use technology versus general use technology as your order of preference and what you want to introduce. And I'll talk through specifics of that as we go through. Then I would also say absolutely choosing applications and tools that you pay for versus ones that are free. And we'll talk about that as well. For me, it's a pretty strict no social media policy. And for this, I'm just talking through middle school. Beyond that, it may be a different story. Again, that's a personal preference. I think it's good advice in general, but obviously another rule is you're the one who should know your kids best. know their situation best, and there may be scenarios in your individual case where that's a different rule that you want to make in your household. Um, you don't have to be perfect with parenting in general. Don't worry, you won't be. You'll make lots of mistakes. I've definitely made some in general, and even in the technology space, which I try to be good about and care a lot about. And I'll talk about at least one of those as we go through the details. So that's kind of the overall high level picture of how I think about being a parent CTO for my kids and managing their technology. And for this, we'll go through kind of zero through middle school, which is the area that I have experience with. Again, these are based on a lot of sources that I've come across. Some of it's my own personal preference. Pick and choose what works and resonates for you. I'm sure I won't cover every possible scenario. So you might think at kind of at birth, at a very young age, that technology is not all that relevant, or you may not have devices for your kids, probably not. But it's already something to start thinking about, and especially this modeling piece. I know there's been lots of research and studies about babies looking at their parents for attention, and their parents are looking at a phone, and it's sort of establishing earlier on what is getting more attention when the baby wants that from their parent, and thinking about the phone as something that is desirable for their attention, and establishing that at a really young age. So trying to avoid doing that and giving your kids or very young kids the attention that they're looking for. And I get it, it can be hard. I was a sleep deprived parent for a number of years, so sometimes you want to just zone out and look at your phone and try and escape the world for a little bit, but understand that is modeling some behavior that they're picking up on at a very early age. Again, if you want to establish habits for your kids when they're older, let's say you don't want to have devices at the table when you're having a meal or when you're having dinner, things like that. I think that's helpful to start that as early as possible, even if you might think, oh, well, a baby's not really paying that much attention or understanding what's happening. They pick up on that, and quickly as your kids get older, all of a sudden they'll have an opinion and be voicing that. So if you can start that early on, if that's something that's important to you and that you want, I think it helps just to be consistent from an early age. At this time, I know there are some toys for young kids where they have AI embedded in the toy. I would say this is a hard no right now for a number of reasons. Maybe it'll change in the future, but there's been a number of examples where these AI toys have said things that you absolutely wouldn't want a toy saying to a young kid. Just from a technology perspective, you're sort of beta testing this technology with your kids, so it's early on. Even if this is something you're enthusiastic about, or maybe in the future is more worked out with some of these bugs, then fine. But I would say for the time being, I would avoid that. I think it's also putting some barriers in between forming some bonds with real people, with imagination. So I would avoid doing that if possible. And with some of these devices, maybe to help rock a kid to sleep and get them to sleep, I get it. It's tough, and it can also feel very overwhelming, especially as a new parent, how to learn all of these different skills. But it is, I think, remarkably intuitive when you're in that, and I think you're depriving yourself of some of that natural ability to connect and be a caregiver if we're putting technology in the way of doing that. And it's not really as hard as it may seem, and you'll surprise yourself, and I think impress yourself if you make that effort and kind of go through the natural way of caregiving as opposed to outsourcing it to technology. One of the pieces of technology that I think is instrumental and amazing, especially for young kids, is having a baby monitor, being able to see what's going on when you're not directly in the room without disturbing your young kids' sleep. It also can be pretty entertaining sometimes, some of the things you see. Now, when I had it, it was really just a kind of a direct monitoring connection. There's lots of different applications now where you can watch it from your phone or things like that, which is, I think, very convenient in a lot of ways. You could go a longer distance, not too far, but or maybe you have somebody at home and somebody away and they want to see what's happening. So a lot of really useful things as a parent, but then I would also caution, this is the first time, or one of the first times, you have to start thinking about that data and privacy and who can access the camera feed into your house watching your baby? Where is that data stored? Is it being used to train algorithms and automated systems? So, what fun you get to think about this as a new parent. But that is potentially one of the trade-offs to a lot of the advantages of using it through an app as opposed to kind of a direct wireless connection like it was when I had babies. So just something to think about there. Um, Reading to your kids is really important, especially at a young age. I think physical books are a great way to start. There's been a lot of research. I think Read or Come Home, a book that I love, talks a bit about it. It talks about sort of helping build the spatial reasoning part of your brain, sort of the tactile piece of kind of feeling the book, hearing your voice, read through two different characters, things like that. I don't think digital books are terrible, and I think they can play a place, but you're sort of starting to open up the device box at that point. So I try and do it at a minimal level if you can. Um, Now, as your kids start getting a little older, you might think about getting them kind of first devices or toys or resources that they can play with that are digital. This is where I'd go back to those principles of single purpose versus general purpose and friction. And I'll give an example here of sort of like a Kindle for kids versus an iPad. So similar in terms of, tablet, tech profile, that sort of thing. A Kindle in a kid's version is completely locked down to browse the internet, to get all sorts of random apps and things like that. You get sort of a curated set of apps that are approved and books and things like that. It's a kid's account, so sometimes it's difficult. If you want to put certain types of content on there, you have to switch between the parent mode and the kids modes and things like that. So there's friction there. But I think that's actually a good thing. You're limiting what content can be there, and it's single purpose. You can't browse the internet. You can't do everything. There's a couple things on there that your kids can do. Contrast that with an iPad, which can be very convenient, can do all of the same features that the Kindle can do, but not quite so easy to lock it down, exposing to pretty much the entire internet if you're not configuring it a certain way. And what I think a lot of parents don't think about is you give your kids an iPad or some device like that has iMessage or a texting app on it. You're essentially giving them a cell phone at what's often is a very young age, and that may not be something that you want to do, and maybe not realizing that, and you're sort of setting this precedent that if you have the iPad, you effectively, when you're on a Wi-Fi network, you have a cell phone in your hands at a pretty young age. I think screen limits are good. That was something, that we did that I think was successful. Then, like many parents, and this would I think be one of the areas that was a bit of a failing is, COVID pandemic hit. Everybody was working from home. Kids were at home. Didn't have a whole lot of schoolwork or things to do, and a lot of those device limits went out the window. So not ideal, not super happy about that, but that was kind of the reality of what happened at the time. And then kind of with that precedent being set, it was a little bit hard to rein things in gradually afterwards. So overall it's worked out okay, but again, I would say that was an area that in an ideal world I would have kept consistent a little bit longer. Um, Continuing on, as getting a little bit older, they may want sort of more gaming or things like that. Again, this is something where paying for a device and paying for games versus getting them for free, where your kids are the product or being advertised to or having their data collected, would recommend. I think Nintendo has always been really good at these products. The Switch is great for that. You can do a lot of the games are very kid friendly. You can use them kind of in group play. You don't have to do a lot of stuff online. If you are, it can be pretty locked down to who they're able to play with. I think the other major consoles are fine too, but you might need to do a little bit more if you're concerned about sort of playing online, maybe exposure to more violent games and content and things like that. So I thought that the Switch was a good one. Um, I'll My kids fortunately never play Roblox. I know it's a popular platform. There's a whole great episode that Cal Newport just did on this. They also had the CEO on Hard Fork, and it was characterized by Cal as a hunting ground for predators. So even though it sounds cute, not an area that I want my kids playing on. So just investigate these games. If just because they're popular doesn't necessarily mean they're a safe or a good place for your kids to be playing. Um, things like Fortnite, maybe not quite as bad as Roblox, but still getting into things where they're trying to get people to spend money, or almost sort of like gambling on loot boxes and things like that. You probably don't want your kids being groomed as gambling consumers at a young age, and just sort of a mindless game anyway. So be aware of what they're playing. Play games with your kids if you like games. See what they're up to. Stay involved. If you're seeing things that you don't like, then change it. Say this is not a good choice, and explain why that is. Um, all right, so moving on from sort of gaming devices, fun stuff. As they're getting older, oftentimes in school, the schools will give them a laptop at a certain age. So, like it or not, they're going to get exposed to that. Many schools have a lot of their content online, whether it's Google Classroom or one of the other education tech providers. So that's probably something that you won't necessarily have a choice about. I think overall the schools are pretty good. I would not expect a middle school to be on par with an enterprise IT department. So if you're coming from that domain, there may be some things that you see as opportunities or things that you find frustrating that they don't do, but they try, and it's right. There's only so many resources that they have. I've often found that schools will get pretty upset when kids find their way around things, and sometimes for good reason, and other times just because they're mad that kids did something they weren't supposed to do. I think they should look at that more kind of like getting free red teaming and security testing. But something to bear in mind if your kids are very much into exploring and figuring out what they can do in these environments, schools might not necessarily love that. Um, you know, Laptops are convenient because they can move them around and bring them to school. The thing that to consider with that is it can be very private what they're looking at, which may or may not be something that you want. I think it's a good idea to know what your kids are up to online. What we have, in addition to the laptops the kids get from school, we have a couple desktops set up in a semi-private office. And they're shared. So if you're up to things in there, you have tabs open. People are going to see what you're doing. So I think that's nice to have if you have the opportunity to have shared laptops where big monitors, it's kind of visible what people are doing. You have an opportunity to do things, but it's not totally private. Just limits, I think, some of the dangers that your kids can get into. Along those lines, generally having a rule that there are no devices in rooms. Sometimes that doesn't happen during the day, but absolutely at night, those devices should be sleeping somewhere outside of the room. Even if there's nothing particularly bad that your kids are doing, just so they're going to sleep and being able to wind down, and not getting sucked into other things that are going on there. Now, because of all of the ed tech and classrooms that kids already have, they're likely going to get exposed to some AI chat through that. Maybe some schools will block that. Most that I've kind of been seen lately seem to have it open if they have it as part of their platform. And so I think that's a good idea to have a conversation with your kids about, to use the tool together to go through different scenarios. I think it's really useful as a tool to help get more practice or more homework questions. My kids have used it for that. And then it's also good to illustrate what works well and what doesn't. I was working through with one of my kids some extra questions we were getting an AI chat tool to give us, and then having it explain the answers and doing some math. And one of them it actually explained wrong. So that was a great opportunity to kind of talk about why you need to have some critical thinking and examine what AI systems are giving back to you. So I think use it with your kids, see what they're doing with it, get a sense of how to use it. If they start getting more into sort of the relationship side of things with characters and building Kind of digital companions, definitely an area of concern and something that you want to avoid, but just using it in general is probably not something that you can avoid. So want to make sure that you give your input and kind of show different use cases and maybe some areas that you might want to avoid. When I was a kid, there were payphones everywhere, so if you went out, it wasn't that hard to contact someone. That's really not the case, so you're kind of stuck with some sort of cell phone. When our kids got to a certain age where they were going other places and wanted to get in touch with them, we made the decision to go with the smartwatch route, which lets you do a lot of those things, call people if you get a cellular plan. But there's pretty limited what you can do online, pretty limited what apps you can get. You can do texting, but again, that friction piece, it's not that convenient. I mean, you can do speech to text and do it that way, but that limits it some as well. So both our kids have done that. That seemed like it worked out relatively well. I would say one of the misses that I had there is just with everything plugged in, those devices did go to bed in the kids' room, which I worked out fine, but is not an ideal situation. And then as they're getting older and switching to phones, then those are not going to bed in the room. So let me see. Yeah, lastly, eventually kids are going to get phones at one point or another. We tried to hold out as long as we could. How much pressure in the environment is going to be a factor. One of the things that I've observed too that is sometimes a little frustrating is that the school would assume that kids of a certain age had phones so they could do some things with apps or trips or things like that, which I think could have been better aligned with what parents wanted or some more input there. But that being said, it's kind of worked out now that our oldest has a cell phone, and again, keeping it locked down, keeping that friction, controlling what's on there, no social media, phone going to bed outside of the room. That's something that I started doing a few years ago as well. So I hope that, I think that helps me modeling it. And actually, to be honest, for me, it's helpful for me that I'm not the only one doing that, to keep consistent with putting my phone to bed where, away from where I sleep. So then it's not really a big thing. And again, the timing for this, a lot of people say, wait till 8th, wait till high school. That was our aspiration. We didn't quite get there, but it'll sort of depend on where you're at. And again, just, knowing your kids, you don't have to spy on them with everything they're doing unless you have something to worry about specifically, but keeping a general tabs on what they're up to and then how it's impacting them. So a lot to unpack here. I'm sure I missed many things. Hopefully that's helpful, and will help you kind of think about how your role as a parent CTO, whether you're presently doing that or potentially in the future or know others that are doing that. Hopefully this will be some helpful thoughts for you. So again, if you enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Talk to Me PDD.